For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople stood like a living legend. A city so wealthy, so well defended, and so absurdly difficult to conquer that people joked it had divine insurance. Empires rose and fell around it. Crusaders came and went, and armies shattered themselves against its walls. This wasn't just a city. It was the last beating heart of Rome. So when 1453 arrived, and a 21-year-old Ottoman sultan pointed his cannons at those ancient walls, people across the medieval world watched in disbelief. This showdown wasn't supposed to happen. Constantinople was the fortress that couldn't fall. And yet, it did. Today, we're going to break down what actually happened during the fall of Constantinople, why the Byzantines were hanging on by a thread, how the Ottomans turned gunpowder into their ultimate trump card, and why this single event didn't just end a city, but helped create the modern world. This is the story of how one siege changed everything. If you had to name the moment the Middle Ages ended and the modern world began, you might think of the Renaissance or Columbus, or maybe some invention like the printing press. But there's a strong case to be made that the real turning point, the moment everything shifted, happened in 1453, when a young Ottoman sultan did something nobody had managed to do for more than 1,000 years. He took the city that was supposed to be untakeable. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople. A city that outlived empires, defeated armies, stared down crusades, shrugged off sieges, and became the glittering heartbeat of an entire civilization. And yet in 1453, it collapsed, not because it was weak, but because the world around it had changed forever. Let's begin with the city itself. Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the city, the bridge between Europe and Asia, a fortress wrapped in walls so massive and so brilliantly engineered that people genuinely believed God himself had reinforced them. These were the Theodosian Walls, triple layers of stone towers, battlements, and moats. For 1,000 years, they were basically the medieval version of an impenetrable firewall. If your army didn't bring siege weapons or a miracle, you weren't getting in. The city sat on a peninsula, surrounded by water, controlling the entrance to the Black Sea. It was a trade hub, a cultural center, a religious capital, and the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire. And yes, let's clear this up. The Byzantines were Romans. They spoke Greek, sure, but their laws, institutions, and identity all came directly from Rome. When Constantinople fell, the last living piece of the Roman Empire fell with it. But by the 1400s, the empire was a shadow of its former self. Centuries of war crusades, internal conflict, and economic strain had chipped away at Byzantine power. What used to be a giant empire spanning the Mediterranean was now basically a city with a few scattered territories. Think of it like a company that used to dominate the entire market, but is now surviving off nostalgia and a very, very old brand identity. Meanwhile, their neighbors, the Ottoman Turks, were rising fast. And at the center of that rise was a young, ambitious sultan named Mehmed II. Mehmed came to power with a chip on his shoulder and a goal burned into his mind: take Constantinople and finish what his predecessors had started. The Ottomans had already surrounded the city on 3 sides, conquering former Byzantine lands. Constantinople was the final prize, the ultimate trophy, the key to transforming the Ottomans from a regional power into a world empire. But wanting the city and taking it were very different things. Because those walls still stood, and they had stopped armies far larger than Mehmed's. But Mehmed understood something critical warfare was changing. Gunpowder was becoming the future, and Constantinople's ancient defenses weren't built for that kind of world. So he brought in a Hungarian engineer named Urban, a man who specialized in building cannons. Not just any cannons. These were the biggest cannons the medieval world had ever seen. One of them was so massive it needed dozens of oxen just to move it. When it fired, the shockwave could be felt for miles. These cannons were designed to do the one thing the Theodosian Walls couldn't withstand: sustained concentrated bombardment. In 1452, Mehmed built a massive fortress called Rumeli Hisarı on the Bosphorus Strait, effectively cutting Constantinople off from Black Sea support. He gathered somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers, janissaries, cavalry, infantry, engineers, artillery teams. He constructed a fleet to block the city's harbor, the Golden Horn. This wasn't just a siege. This was a full-scale technological, logistical, and psychological assault. Facing him was Emperor Constantine XI, the last emperor of Byzantium. He had around 7,000 soldiers, including a few thousand Genoese and Venetian allies, against an enemy more than 10 times larger. But the Byzantines had something the Ottomans didn't: the walls. Those legendary walls. Constantine knew that if the city could hold long enough, maybe Western Europe would send reinforcements. Maybe the siege would break. Maybe Constantinople would survive one more time. The siege began in April 1453. Ottoman cannons started pounding the walls day and night. Huge cracks appeared. The defenders rushed to repair them. The rhythm of the siege became a cycle of destruction and rebuilding. Cannon fires. Stones collapse. Byzantines rebuild. Repeat. One of the most dramatic moments came when the Ottomans realized they couldn't force their fleet past the giant chain blocking the Golden Horn. So Mehmed came up with an idea that sounded insane: move the ships overland. Using greased wooden tracks, hundreds of workers, and an absurd amount of determination, they dragged dozens of ships across hills and down into the Golden Horn behind the chain. When Constantinople woke up and saw an Ottoman fleet inside their supposedly protected harbor, morale collapsed. Still, the defenders held on. The walls, despite centuries of age and constant bombardment, refused to fall. The people inside the city prayed rebuilt and refused to surrender. This siege lasted 53 days, filled with assaults, counterattacks, tunneling, sabotage, exhaustion, and moments where both sides came inches away from breaking. Then, on May 29, 1453, everything unraveled. Ottoman cannons had created a massive breach near the gate of St. Romanus. Constantine XI threw himself into the thick of the fighting, rallying his men. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, was badly wounded and carried off the battlefield. His troops panicked. A chain reaction of fear spread down the walls. And with one final push, the Ottomans broke through. Constantine X refused to flee. According to legend, he tore off his imperial regalia and charged into battle, disappearing into the chaos. His body was never definitively found. With their emperor gone and their defenses collapsed, the city fell. After more than 1,000 years, the Roman Empire ended that morning. But the story doesn't end with the fall. To understand why 1453 mattered, we have to look at what came after. First, the Ottoman Empire became one of the most powerful empires in the world. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became their capital, a center of culture, trade, scholarship, and administration for centuries. Second, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. With the Ottomans controlling the primary land routes to Asia, European merchants started searching for alternative paths to the east. This directly contributed to the age of exploration voyages by Portugal, Spain, and eventually everyone else. In other words, 1453 helped set the stage for global exploration, colonization, and the modern world economy. Third, the fall triggered an intellectual migration. Greek scholars fled west, bringing with them manuscripts, knowledge, philosophy, and classical ideas that had been preserved in Byzantium. These ideas fueled the Renaissance Europe's great cultural revival. And finally, the siege of 1453 marked the arrival of gunpowder warfare in Europe. Cannons proved that ancient fortifications, once unbeatable, were now obsolete. The balance of military power shifted dramatically. Castles, walls, and medieval armies would never be the same again. So why did 1453 matter? Because it was a hinge in history. A moment where an old world ended and a new one began. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire. It changed trade, it changed warfare, it changed culture, it changed the map of the world, and it helped set into motion the forces that shaped the modern age. And it leaves us with a fascinating question: if Constantinople had survived even for another century, how different would our world look today? So that's the fall of Constantinople, the moment when ancient history collided with the modern age. A city once seen as invincible finally gave way, not because its walls failed, but because the world around them had evolved. Cannons grew stronger. Empires grew hungrier. And a young sultan was determined to reshape his future. The fall didn't just bring down the last remnant of Rome. It reshaped trade, pushed Europe toward new oceans, fueled the Renaissance, and rebalanced global power. In one dramatic morning, 100 years of Roman history ended, and the Ottoman era began. If Constantinople had survived just a little longer, the world map, the age of exploration, and even the Renaissance might look completely different. But history chose 1453, and nothing was the same afterward. If you enjoyed exploring this turning point in history, stick around. There's a lot more to explain, and many more moments where a single event changed the world forever.